What's the most insane true prison story you've heard? Richard walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas where he was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting. Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now. Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable. He made friends really easily even in prison. Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court. He saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards him. Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend Steve, and Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. So Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him. As he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. When Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything. "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was a hothead and Richard knew that. But a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. So this was routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. Steve walks right up to Richard and goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and turned his head sideways. "What?" Steve stared at Richard, expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something. Eventually, he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. Steve said, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line and I tried to talk to you. You completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people that embarrassed me and made me look bad." Richard replied, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it. "Richard, I know it was you." Richard replied, "No, Steve, I'm sorry, I have no idea what this is about." These two continued to go back and forth on this. At some point, they both noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. When they noticed other inmates were beginning to walk over to see what was going on and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard? Fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk, but the exchange with Steve had really weirded him out. Especially because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down. Is she okay?" At first Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now at first, Richard thought this was just a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them. Or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing. And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, "Wait a minute, is someone screwing with me?" The next morning during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did. Instead, he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to just be able to people watch everyone inside the cafeteria. That afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious. I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious until 1 week after the interaction he had with Steve. Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. He just stood up and stared. He felt his heart starting to race faster and he felt his breath speeding up. Steve was actually sitting next to him and said, "Hey Richard, what's going on?" Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, so it really couldn't have been him. But the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just a genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky. It just so happened that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself. It all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird. Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart. They all confused Ricky for Richard. They literally looked the exact same. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw their two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case, supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky, he was never actually tried for the robbery.